The Missouri heat of late August had a way of pressing down on a person, thick and wet, making the very air feel like a damp wool blanket. Inside the Bennett farmhouse, it was no different. The air, heavy with the scent of boiled laundry and simmering resentment, clung to the parlor where Nora Bennett sat mending her father's shirt. The needle moved with a steady, practiced rhythm, a small, quiet rebellion against the loud, glittering idleness of her 3 older sisters. Vivian, the eldest, fanned herself with a copy of Godey's Lady's Book. I declare, I shall simply melt into a puddle on this settee. Margaret, be a dear and fetch some lemonade. Margaret, perched by the window to catch the faintest whisper of a breeze, sighed dramatically. I cannot possibly move. The effort would be my undoing. Caroline, inspecting her perfectly manicured nails, let out a silvery laugh. Oh, let Nora get it. She enjoys being useful. Do you not? Nora. Nora did not look up from her sewing. The needle dipped and rose, pulling the dark thread through the sturdy cotton. A tidy, nearly invisible seam. That was her place in this family, to be tidy, useful, and nearly invisible. While her sisters had inherited their mother's delicate beauty, her fair skin, and her easy charm, Nora had been blessed with her father's square jaw, sensible brown hair, and a pair of hands more suited to kneading dough than playing the pianoforte. They were not unkind hands, but they were not the hands of a lady, a fact her sisters never tired of pointing out in their light, teasing way that somehow stung more than outright cruelty. It was Vivian who found the advertisement. She had grown bored with the fashion plates and flipped to the back pages of a gazette someone had left behind. A sudden peal of laughter cut through the afternoon stupor. "Oh, you simply must hear this," she announced, her eyes dancing with mischief. "Matrimonial notices. Lonely hearts of the West seek respectable female companionship with a view to matrimony." She read one aloud, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Widower, 40 years of age, with 3 small children and 160 acres in Kansas, seeks a plain woman of good character who is not afraid of hard work." A plain woman. Can you imagine? Caroline and Margaret giggled. "They might as well just ask for a beast of burden," Margaret said. Then Vivian's gaze, sharp and wicked, fell upon Nora. A slow smile spread across her face. "Girls, I have the most wonderful, terrible idea." Nora's needle paused mid-stitch. She felt a familiar cold dread coil in her stomach. "Let us write a reply," Vivian went on, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "For our dear sister Nora. She is of good character, and heaven knows she is not afraid of hard work." "Vivian, do not," Nora said, her voice low. But the game had already begun. Caroline fetched a pen and paper, her movements quick with excitement. They huddled together, their silk and lace rustling, their heads bent in gleeful concentration. "What shall we say?" Caroline asked, pen poised. "We must be honest." "Of course," Vivian said, a false sincerity in her tone. "Let us describe her virtues. 24 years old. Plain of face but strong of back," Margaret chimed in. "An excellent cook, capable of feeding a dozen hungry field hands on a moment's notice," Caroline added, scribbling furiously. "Proficient in all domestic arts, from darning socks to butchering a hog. Quiet disposition, some might say dull, but we shall call it serene." Each phrase was a carefully polished stone thrown at her. Nora sat frozen, the shirt in her lap, listening to them construct a caricature of her existence. They were taking every part of her that had value, every skill she had painstakingly learned to make herself useful, and twisting it into a mark of shame. They were painting a portrait of the ugly daughter, the leftover daughter, the one for whom a desperate widower in the middle of nowhere was the only hope. When they were finished, Vivian read the letter aloud, a masterpiece of backhanded compliments and thinly veiled insults. It was a joke, a cruel, elaborate prank meant to remind her of her place. We should send it to that one in Wyoming territory, Margaret suggested, pointing at the paper. A rancher. It sounds so rugged and hopeless. Nora finally looked up. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. You are not funny, she said, the words barely a whisper. Vivian just smiled. Oh, Nora, do not be so serious. It is only a bit of fun. She sealed the letter, and the next day, when their father went to town for supplies, she posted it. The sisters forgot about it almost immediately, moving on to new amusements, new dresses, new gossip. But Nora did not forget. The words of their letter were branded onto her memory. Plain of face but strong of back, she carried the humiliation with her, a heavy stone in her pocket, as she went about her chores. In the quiet of her small attic room, she would take out the journal her mother had given her just before she died. It was a simple leather-bound book, its pages still mostly empty. On the first page, her mother's elegant script read, "Write your truth. Nora, no one else can." She had never known what to write. Her truth felt too small, too gray to be put into words. But now, she felt the urge to write down the letter her sisters had sent, to record the exact words of their cruelty. But she could not bring herself to do it. It felt like admitting defeat. Nearly a month passed. The summer began to fade, the nights carrying a new crispness. Then the letter arrived. It was addressed in a strong, clear hand to Miss Nora Bennett. It bore a postmark from a place she had only ever seen on a map, Red Mesa, Wyoming territory. Her father held it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead mouse. What is the meaning of this? Nora. Who is this man? Jack Rohr. The sisters, drawn by the commotion, gathered around. Vivian's eyes went wide with dawning horror and delight. It cannot be, she breathed. Mr. Bennett tore the envelope open. His face grew darker with every line he read. The letter was short, brutally to the point. He read it aloud, his voice tight with fury. Miss Bennett, I am in receipt of the letter sent on your behalf. You are described as a plain but capable woman. My ranch requires capability above all else. I am 36 years old, a widower. I have a son, Thomas, who is 4. My first wife died in childbirth 2 years ago. The house needs a woman's hand. I need a partner, not a parlor ornament. If the description of your skills is accurate and you are not prone to hysterics or complaint, I believe we could make a suitable arrangement. Enclosed, you will find a ticket for the Union Pacific line from St. Louis to Cheyenne, and a further $20 for your travel expenses. The train departs on the 14th of September. I will meet you at the station in Red Mesa. Sincerely, Jack Rohr. Silence descended on the parlor, thick and suffocating. Then, Caroline let out a choked gasp that turned into a wild shriek of laughter. Margaret and Vivian joined in, clinging to each other as they howled, their laughter echoing the cruelty of that afternoon weeks ago. This was better than they could have ever imagined. Their joke had gotten a reply. A partner, not a parlor ornament, Vivian cried, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. He sounds utterly charming. He accepted our offer, Margaret squealed. He actually wants the ugly daughter. Her father's face was ashen with rage. He was not laughing. He was a man who prized his family's reputation above all else. This was a stain, a public mortification. This is a disgrace, he seethed, crumpling the letter in his fist. My daughter, advertised like livestock. You will write back to this man immediately and inform him that it was a childish error. You will apologize for this embarrassment. They all looked at Nora, expecting tears, a pleading denial, a collapse into shame. She stood very still in the center of the room, the eye of the storm, her sister's laughter, her father's fury. It all washed over her. But inside, something had shifted. The heavy stone she had been carrying in her pocket no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a weapon. This man, Jack Rohr, had read the worst parts of her. the caricature her sisters had created, and he had not flinched. He had not offered pity or poetry. He had offered a ticket. He had seen the list of her supposed flaws: plain, hard-working, quiet, and he had seen value. He needed what she was. In that moment, the joke her sisters had played on her transformed. It was no longer a cage. It was a door, an escape hatch from a life of being useful and unseen. She looked at her father's furious face, at her sister's mocking smiles. She saw the next 40 years of her life stretching out before her in this house, mending and cooking and fading into the wallpaper while they married well and visited with their beautiful children. She saw a future of being pitied, the spinster aunt, good old Nora. And then she saw another future, a vast, unknown landscape under a sky bigger than any she had ever known. It was a terrifying, uncertain future, but it would be hers. She would be choosing it. She lifted her chin. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the room with the clean, sharp edge of a freshly honed blade. "No," she said, "I will not write to him." Her father stared at her, dumbfounded. "What did you say?" "He sent a ticket," Nora said, her gaze steady, "and I am going to use it." The laughter died in her sisters' throats, replaced by stunned disbelief. Vivian took a step forward. "Nora, you cannot be serious." "It was a joke. You cannot possibly go off to marry some savage in the wilderness." "Why not?" Nora asked, a strange, new calm settling over her. "You described my qualifications perfectly. It seems I am exactly what the gentleman requires." She walked over to her father and gently pried the crumpled letter and the train ticket from his fist. She smoothed them out on the table. The paper felt solid, real, a contract. The 2 weeks that followed were a quiet war. Her father refused to speak to her, his silence a wall of condemnation. Her sisters oscillated between disbelief, scorn, and a strange, grudging curiosity. They could not understand her. To them, she was throwing her life away, embracing a humiliation they had only intended as a fleeting jest. To Nora, she was finally picking her life up. She packed a single trunk. She took sensible wool dresses, her sturdiest boots, and her mending kit. She packed the small, tin music box her grandmother had left her, a fragile piece of beauty to carry into the unknown. And last, she packed her mother's journal. That night, for the first time, she wrote in it, not the story of the joke, but the story of the choice. "My life begins on the 14th of September. I do not know where I am going, but I am going there on my own 2 feet." On the morning of her departure, no one came to see her off. A farmhand drove her and her trunk in the buckboard to the St. Louis station. In silence. The city was a chaotic symphony of noise and smells, a world away from the predictable quiet of the farm. The train station was a cathedral of steam and iron, teeming with people from every walk of life. Soldiers, businessmen, families with weary faces, all heading west. Nora stood on the platform, her trunk at her feet, the ticket clutched in her hand. For a moment, a wave of panic washed over her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. There was no one to say goodbye to, no one to wish her well. She had severed her roots, and now she was just a seed, thrown to the wind. Then the train whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that vibrated deep in her bones. It was not a sound of leaving. She realized it was a sound of arrival. It was the call of the West, the promise of a place where a person was measured not by the fairness of their face, but by the strength of their back and the truth in their heart. It was the sound of her life, finally beginning. She picked up her bag, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the train. The moment the train lurched into motion, Nora felt a violent severing, as if an invisible thread connecting her to the Missouri farmhouse had been snapped. The carriage was a world unto itself, smelling of coal smoke, oiled leather, and the close, human scent of too many bodies in a confined space. It was noisy, a rattling, clattering microcosm of the nation, all pushing westward. Nora sat straight-backed on the plush but worn seat, her hands folded over her single carpet bag. She had chosen a seat by the window, wanting to watch the world she was leaving disappear. Across the aisle, a woman in a fine silk traveling dress eyed her with disdain. The woman whispered something to her husband, a portly man with a gold watch chain, and he too glanced over, his gaze lingering for a moment on Nora's plain brown dress and serviceable bonnet. Nora felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks. She was an object of speculation, a puzzle, a single woman, traveling alone, dressed not for a social visit but for labor. The assumptions were a palpable weight in the air. She was a spinster aunt going to a poor relation, a governess, or perhaps something less respectable. None of them, she was sure, would ever guess the truth, which felt both more scandalous and more practical than any of their imaginings. She focused her attention on the window, the rolling green hills of Missouri, dotted with familiar oak and hickory trees, slid past. It was a gentle, forgiving landscape, a land that held its people closely. Yet, for her, it had been a beautiful cage. The train chugged relentlessly onward, and with every mile, Nora felt the bars of that cage dissolving. She was terrified, but it was a clean terror, sharp and clear, not the dull, suffocating ache of her life before. That evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and violet, she discreetly opened her mother's journal. The other passengers were engaged in conversation or dozing. Under the flickering gaslight of the carriage, she wrote, September 14th. The train never stops moving. I feel it in my bones, a constant shudder. I have been watching the land change. I think I have never really looked at the land before. At home, it was just the backdrop for chores. Here, it is the only thing that is real. A woman across the aisle looks at me as if I am a piece of dirt on her shoe. Perhaps I am. I am leaving the place I was born to marry a man I have never met. He knows me only as plain and capable. I pray that will be enough. The second day dawned over the vast, flat plains of Kansas. The trees had vanished, replaced by an endless ocean of grass that rippled in the wind. The sky was immense, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to go on forever, pressing down on the flat earth. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. In Missouri, the world had been portioned off by tree lines and fences and hills. Here, there were no edges. Nora felt impossibly small, a tiny speck moving through an enormous, empty room. The train felt like a fragile toy, its plume of smoke the only proof of its passage. The air that bled through the window frames was different. Too, it was dry and thin, carrying a strange, herbaceous scent she had never smelled before. It was the smell of dust and sun-baked earth and wild things. Sage. A man in a dusty hat told a fellow passenger. The wind was a constant presence, not a gentle breeze but a steady, insistent force that seemed to be trying to scour the land clean. In the afternoon, the train slowed to take on water at a small, wind-beaten settlement that was little more than a handful of wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness. Some passengers got off to stretch their legs. Nora remained in her seat, an observer. She watched rough-looking men with sun-creased faces and women whose dresses were practical, not fashionable. Their hands reddened and calloused. There was a directness in their gaze, a lack of artifice that was both startling and refreshing. They were not inspecting her for her social standing. They were simply looking. Feeling a sudden need for a small comfort, she reached into her bag and took out her grandmother's music box. It was small and made of dark, polished wood, with a painted yellow bird on the lid. She shielded it in her lap and carefully turned the tiny key. A delicate, tinkling melody filled the small space around her, a fragile counterpoint to the rhythmic clatter of the train. It was a tune from a world of lace doilies and afternoon tea, a piece of impossible beauty in this harsh, grand landscape. The notes were like drops of cool water on her parched soul. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she was not a mail-order bride hurtling toward an unknown fate, but just a girl, listening to a pretty song. That night, she wrote again, the pen scratching against the paper as the carriage swayed. September 15th. Today I saw the true meaning of distance. The land does not end. I do not think it has an end. It makes a person feel their own smallness. The people here are different. Their faces are burned by the sun and wind. They do not smile easily. I played my music box. It sounded like a ghost. I wonder if Mr. Roar will like music. I wonder if he has a pianoforte. The letter did not say. It only spoke of what was required. I will be required. That is a new feeling. The third day brought the Wyoming Territory. The land began to buckle and rise. Strange. Flat-topped mesas and jagged rock formations broke the monotony of the plains. Their sides streaked with red and ochre. It was a raw, unfinished landscape. A place that did not care for softness or subtlety. It was beautiful, but with a severe, dangerous beauty that demanded respect. The air grew thinner, cleaner. Nora found she had to breathe more deeply. Her fellow passengers had thinned out, many having disembarked in the larger towns of Nebraska. Those who remained were mostly bound for the forts or the goldfields or the sprawling ranches of the territory. The woman in the silk dress was gone, and Nora found she did not miss her judgment. The conversations around her were of cattle prices, the threat of an early winter, and the doings of the railroad. It was a world of practical concerns, of survival and enterprise. She struck up a brief conversation with an army wife heading to Fort Laramie. The woman was young, not much older than Nora, but her face was already etched with a deep weariness. "You are new to the West," the woman stated, not unkindly. "Yes," Nora admitted. "It is very large." The woman gave a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, it is large. All right, it is large and it is hard. It will take everything you have and then ask for more. You have people waiting for you." "I am to be married," Nora said, the words feeling strange and brittle on her tongue. The woman's expression softened with something like pity. "Well, I wish you the best of luck. You will need it. Out here, a good, steady partner is worth more than all the gold in the hills." "A good, steady partner," the woman's words echoed Jack Roar's. "I need a partner, not a parlor ornament." For the first time, Nora allowed herself a sliver of hope. Perhaps this was a place where her own brand of steadiness could be a virtue. Perhaps her strong hands and her quiet disposition were not flaws to be overcome, but assets to be valued. As the train rattled towards Cheyenne, the final major stop before the smaller line that would take her to Red Mesa, she felt a profound shift within herself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was now joined by a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. She had survived the judgment of her family. She had survived the journey. She had looked upon a world that was vast and indifferent and terrifying, and she had not broken. She was a seed that had been thrown to the wind. Yes, but she had not been scattered to dust. She was about to land, and she would either take root or she would perish. The choice was that simple and that stark. Her last entry in the journal before arriving was the shortest of all. September 16th. Tomorrow I will meet him. The mountains are on the horizon, like teeth against the sky. I am no longer the girl who got on this train in St. Louis. I do not know who I am yet, but I am ready to find out. The branch line train to Red Mesa was smaller, slower, and seemed to sigh with every turn of its wheels. It crawled through a landscape of stark, red rock canyons and wide, arid valleys where the wind was the only constant motion, when it finally hissed to a stop at a simple wooden platform. Nora felt as if she had reached the edge of the world. Red Mesa was not a town so much as a declaration of intent, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, and a handful of houses, all clinging to the railroad tracks as if for dear life. A single man stood on the platform, his back to the station house, watching the train arrive. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a practical canvas coat against the ceaseless wind. He did not move as the few other passengers disembarked. He waited, his stillness a stark contrast to the steam and noise of the engine. Nora knew, with a certainty that made her heart hammer against her ribs, that this was him. She took a steadying breath, gathered her bag, and stepped down onto the dusty platform. The wind immediately tugged at her bonnet, whipping a stray strand of hair across her face. She walked toward him, her sturdy boots making soft sounds in the dust. When she was a few feet away, he turned his head. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, met hers. His face was weathered, browned by the sun, with the lines etched at the corners of his eyes and mouth. He was not a handsome man in the way her sisters would have appreciated, but it was a strong face, a face that had seen too much sun and too much winter and had not looked away. He assessed her in a single, sweeping glance, taking in her plain dress, her capable hands clutching her bag, her steady gaze. It was not a look of welcome, but of verification. "Miss Bennet," he asked. His voice was a low baritone, as steady and unadorned as the landscape around them. "Mr. Roar," she replied, her own voice surprisingly firm. He nodded once, a curt, decisive gesture. He stepped forward and took her trunk from the porter, lifting it with an ease that spoke of a life of physical labor. He did not offer to take her smaller bag. He did not smile. He simply turned and gestured toward a buckboard wagon waiting nearby. "The ranch is a 2-hour ride from here." The journey was conducted in a near-complete silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves. The emotional distance between them felt as vast and empty as the country they were passing through. This was not a courtship. It was a business arrangement, and the terms had already been set. Jack Roar handled the reins with an economy of motion, his attention fixed on the trail ahead. He pointed out landmarks with brief, factual statements. "That's Roar Creek," gives the ranch its name, and later, as a solid, 2-story house built of timber and stone appeared in the distance. The house. Roar Creek Ranch was nestled in a wide valley, protected on one side by a high, pine-studded ridge. It was a place of substance, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a web of corrals spread out from the main house. It was clear that this was a serious, working operation. As they pulled up to the house, a small boy with a mop of dark hair peeked out from behind the door, his eyes wide and curious. He vanished as soon as he saw Nora. A moment later, the door opened and a woman emerged. She was of Chinese descent, her black hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple, dark tunic and trousers, and her expression was as unreadable as Jack Roar's. "Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Bennet," Jack said, swinging down from the wagon. "She'll need a room." Mrs. Chen's dark, intelligent eyes flickered over Nora. "Another assessment? This one focused on domestic capability." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Her trunk can go in the room next to Thomas's," she said, her English precise and without accent. She was clearly the one who ran the internal mechanics of this house. Jack brought the trunk inside while Nora followed Mrs. Chen. The interior of the house was masculine and sparsely furnished, but meticulously clean. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace and sturdy, well-made furniture, but there was no softness, no sign of a woman's touch, no needlework, no flowers, no clutter of personal keepsakes. And then Nora saw it. In a corner of the room, shrouded in a dusty canvas, covered the unmistakable shape of an upright piano, a silent, hulking ghost. The little boy, Thomas, was hiding behind his father's legs, one small hand clutching the rough fabric of his trousers. Jack placed a hand on his son's head. "Thomas, this is Miss Bennet. She's come to live with us." Thomas stared at her, his expression a mixture of fear and fascination. He was a beautiful child, with his father's gray eyes and a mouth that seemed designed for smiling, though it was not smiling now. Nora's heart gave a painful lurch. She gave him a small, tentative smile, but did not move closer, sensing it would only frighten him more. "The pastor is expecting us in the morning," Jack said to Nora, his tone matter of fact. 10 o'clock, then it will be done." The wedding was as stark and practical as the man himself. It took place not in a church, but in the small, book-lined study of Pastor Michaels, a kind-faced man with weary eyes who seemed accustomed to such pragmatic unions. Jack stood beside her, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the pastor. He wore the same canvas coat he had worn at the station. Nora wore her best wool dress, the one she had saved for Sundays. There were no flowers, no music, no witnesses save for the pastor's wife. They recited the vows, their voices filling the quiet room. The words of the ceremony, meant to speak of love and holy matrimony, felt like the reading of a contract. When it was time for the ring, Jack reached into his waistcoat pocket. He did not pull out a new, shining gold band. Instead, he produced a simple, worn gold ring. "It was my wife's," he said, his voice low and for her ears only. The words were not an endearment, but an explanation, an apology. Perhaps it should be worn. He took her left hand. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he slid the ring onto her finger. It was still warm from his pocket, and for a disorienting moment, Nora felt she could feel the phantom presence of the woman who had worn it before. Sarah. The ghost in the house now had a name, and her ring was on Nora's hand, a heavy, constant reminder of the woman she was replacing. The weight of it was immense, a circle of gold binding her not just to the silent man beside her, but to a past she could never be a part of. She was Mrs. Roar now, but the title felt borrowed, the ring a constant, tangible link to the wife who had come before. Life at Roar Creek fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. The days started before dawn, with the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the kitchen. Nora learned this new world from Mrs. Chen, who communicated more through gesture and example than through words. She showed Nora how the massive wood-burning stove worked, where the stores were kept in the pantry, and how to bake the dense, hearty bread the ranch hands expected. Nora, a quick and willing student, absorbed it all. She was used to work, and the straightforward, demanding nature of the chores was a comfort. She met Ben Cooper, the ranch foreman, a wiry, sun-beaten man with kind eyes who tipped his hat to her and called her ma'am. She saw the other hands only at mealtimes, a dozen or so men who ate quickly and quietly, their face tired and dusty. She was a presence they noted but did not engage with. She was the boss's new wife, a part of the ranch's machinery, like a new plow or a mended fence. Her relationship with Jack remained one of respectful distance. They slept in separate rooms. He was the first to rise and the last to bed, his days consumed by the endless work of the ranch. They spoke of practical matters, the need for more flour from town, a leaking pump, the coming weather. He was fair. He was polite, but he was emotionally inaccessible, a fortress of a man whose gates were rusted shut. Her most difficult and important task was Thomas. The boy watched her constantly with his solemn gray eyes. He would not speak to her, and if she came too close, he would run to his father or to Mrs. Chen. Nora did not press him. She simply made sure his clothes were mended, that he had warm milk before bed, and that there was always a cookie for him on the kitchen table after his nap. She would sometimes sit in the main room and hum softly, filling the silence with a simple tune. She was planting seeds of trust, hoping one of them might someday take root in the boy's lonely heart. One quiet afternoon, a week after her arrival, she found herself alone in the main room. Jack and the hands were out on the range. Thomas was napping. and Mrs. Chen was in the vegetable garden. The house was utterly still. Her eyes were drawn, as they so often were, to the shrouded piano. On impulse, she walked over to it and lifted the canvas cover. A cloud of dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon sun slanting through the window. The keys were yellowed, and the beautiful dark wood was dull. She sat on the bench, her back straight, and gently touched a key in the middle of the keyboard. A single, clear note rang out, slightly out of tune but pure. It hung in the silent room, a sound of profound and startling beauty. It felt like the house had just taken its first breath in a very long time. She played another note, then another, forming a simple, hesitant chord. She did not play a song, just a few random notes, letting the sound wash over her. It was a small act of reclamation, a quiet declaration that she was here, and that she would not be a ghost in this house, too. She did not hear Jack enter. He had come back for a piece of equipment and moved as silently as a shadow. He stood in the doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable. He did not speak. Nora's fingers fell silent, and she quickly lowered the lid over the keys. The house was quiet once more, but something had changed. A single note of music had been played, and, for the first time, the silence that followed felt less like an absence, and more like a pause. The passing of autumn in Wyoming was swift and without ceremony. The pale gold of the aspen leaves vanished almost overnight, and the wind from the mountains carried a new, sharp bite. Nora's life settled into the hard, unyielding rhythm of the ranch. She learned the immense labor of feeding a dozen hungry men 3 times a day, the art of making sourdough starter, the heft of a 50-pound sack of flour. She took over the management of the vast pantry from Mrs. Chen, her neat columns of figures in a ledger bringing a quiet order to the chaos of supply and demand. She was no longer just a resident. She was a functioning, essential part of the machine. Her greatest and most delicate project was Thomas. The boy's silence was a wall she refused to assault directly. Instead, she began a gentle siege, finding a box of his mother's old primers in a dusty chest. She set up a small classroom for him at the kitchen table for an hour each afternoon. At first, he would only watch, his gray eyes solemn as she drew letters on a small slate. She would say them aloud, her voice soft. A, B, C. She never pushed him to repeat them. One day, as she drew a clumsy picture of a horse, he pointed a small finger and whispered a single word. Horse. Triumph surged through Nora, warm and fierce. From then on, the words came in a trickle, then a small stream. He was a bright boy and hungry for the attention. It was during one of these lessons that he looked at the faded inscription inside a book, Sarah Rohr, and asked, "Was that Mama?" Nora's breath caught. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother to her. The ghost of the house suddenly had a question attached to it. "Yes, Thomas," she said gently. "That was your Mama's name." "Do you sit in her chair?" he asked, his voice full of a child's simple, devastating logic. "I suppose I do," Nora answered, her heart aching for him. "But it is your chair, and your father's chair, too. This is our home now." It was a risk, including herself, but it felt like the only true thing to say. He seemed to accept this, and the lesson continued. She had touched the past, not to erase it, but to make a space for the present. The first trip to Red Mesa with Jack was a necessity. Supplies were low, and a list of goods from Ben Cooper required a visit to the general store and the blacksmith. The 2-hour ride was as silent as her first, but the silence felt different. It was less a void and more a shared space, filled with the comfortable sounds of the wagon and the vast country around them. The town, when they arrived, was a hub of activity. Ranchers and homesteaders were laying in supplies for the winter. As Nora stepped down from the buckboard, she felt the stares. She was the talk of the valley, the mail-order bride Jack Rohr had acquired. Whispers followed her like dust devils. She kept her head high, her expression calm, and walked into the general store beside Jack. Inside, a woman turned from the counter, her face a mask of polite surprise. She was beautiful, dressed in a stylish green traveling suit that must have cost a fortune. Her blonde hair coiled perfectly beneath a fashionable hat. "Why, Jack Rohr," the woman said, her voice like honeyed wine. "I had not expected to see you in town." Her gaze slid to Nora, sharp and dismissive. "Lydia," Jack said, his voice flat. He made no move to introduce them. But the woman, Lydia Marsh, smiled a brilliant, predatory smile. "And you must be the new Mrs. Rohr. Welcome to Red Mesa." We were all so surprised. "You must tell me, where is your family from?" The question was a scalpel, designed to reveal Nora's unesteemed origins. "Missouri," Nora replied, her voice even. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Marsh." Before the woman could press her advantage, a man stepped forward, his hand extended to Jack. He was handsome, dressed in a tailored suit, his smile smooth and practiced. "Jack, good to see you. Business is well, I trust." "Martin," Jack acknowledged, his handshake brief, as well as can be expected. The man, Martin Shaw, turned his smile on Nora. It was a warmer, more inclusive smile than Lydia's, but there was something cold in his eyes. "And this must be the lady who has finally brought some light back into that old house. Martin Shaw, at your service, Mrs. Rohr. I run the bank, and have a hand in most other things in this town. If there is ever anything you need, you must not hesitate to ask." His tone was overly sweet, his charm a sticky trap. Nora simply inclined her head. "Mr. Shaw." The encounter was brief, but it left a bitter taste in Nora's mouth. Lydia Marsh was a social rival, a woman who saw Nora as an uncivilized usurper. Martin Shaw was something else, something more dangerous. He had looked at her, but he had been sizing up the Roar Creek operation. They represented the judgment of this new world, one sneering at her lack of pedigree, the other probing for financial weakness. As they finished their business, Nora could feel the weight of the town's curiosity. It was a heavy cloak, woven from the threads of gossip she had only imagined on the train. Now it was real, but as they rode out of town, leaving the whispers behind, she found she did not care as much as she thought she would. Her world was the ranch, the quiet boy learning his letters, the steady rhythm of work. Their opinions were a distant noise. The change in the weather began subtly a few days later. The sky took on a strange, yellowish-gray cast, and the wind, which always blew, fell into an unnerving calm. The animals were restless. Jack and Ben Cooper stood for a long time by the corral, their faces grim as they stared at the mountains to the northwest. "It is coming," Ben said, his voice low, a bad one. "Get the herds moved into the sheltered valley," Jack ordered. "Check the stores and the line shacks. We have until nightfall, maybe less." There was a frantic, controlled energy to the preparations. The hands moved with purpose, their actions stripped of all wasted motion. Nora and Mrs. Chen worked in the house, securing shutters, bringing in extra firewood from the massive, neatly stacked wood piles that stood like fortresses around the house. The wood pile, Nora thought, was a monument to foresight, a physical manifestation of faith against the coming winter. The first flakes began to fall in the late afternoon, small and dry. Within an hour, the world had disappeared. It was not a gentle snowfall, but a furious, horizontal assault. The wind howled like a starving animal, a solid wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Snow, fine and hard as sand, was driven through every tiny crack, piling up in little drifts on the windowsills inside. Looking out the window was like staring into a churning bucket of milk. The barn, only 100 yards away, was completely invisible. Thomas, his face pale, came and stood beside Nora, slipping his small hand into hers. The fear in the house was a palpable thing. Most of the herd was safe, but Jack and a few of the men had gone out after a group of yearlings that had scattered. They had been gone for hours. As darkness fell, the storm intensified. Misses. Chen kept the lamps lit, their golden glow a fragile bubble of safety against the roaring white chaos outside. Nora focused on the tasks at hand. She kept the fire in the great stone hearth blazing, adding logs until it roared in defiance of the wind. She put a massive pot of beef stew on the stove, the rich smell filling the house with a promise of warmth and sustenance. She made coffee, so much coffee that the entire kitchen was filled with its bracing aroma. She was not fighting the storm with an axe or a rope. She was fighting it with fire and food and an absolute refusal to give in to the fear that clawed at her throat. She was holding the center. She held Thomas on her lap, telling him a story about a brave mouse who built a strong house of stone. The boy was trembling, his face buried in her shoulder. She held him tight, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. She thought of Jack, out in that maelstrom, and for the first time, the thought was not of a stranger or a business partner, but of her husband. Late into the night, there was a sudden, thunderous banging on the main door. Ben Cooper stumbled in, his face caked with ice, his eyebrows and mustache frozen white. Two other hands followed, looking more like ghosts than men. "We got the yearlings," Ben gasped, pulling off his frozen gloves. "But the boss, he went back. One of the men, young Miller, took a bad fall. The boss is bringing him in." The wait after that was the worst of all. Nora forced the men to drink hot coffee, her hands steady as she poured. She did not allow the panic to show on her face. She was the anchor in this house, and anchors did not drift. Finally, the door burst open again. Jack appeared, a terrifying figure of ice and snow. He was half carrying, half dragging the young cowboy, Miller, whose leg was clearly broken. Jack's face was a raw, red mask of windburn, his beard and hair frozen solid, but his gray eyes were clear and fiercely alive. He got Miller onto a settle by the fire, his movements economical despite his exhaustion. He looked up, and his eyes met Nora's across the room. He saw the blazing fire, the pot of stew simmering on the stove, the lamps burning brightly. He saw the exhausted men drinking hot coffee. He saw his son, sleepy but safe, curled in a blanket on a chair. And he saw Nora, her face calm, her hands ready, the absolute, unshakable center of the warmth and light that had defied the storm. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them, deeper than any words they had ever exchanged. He had fought the storm outside, a battle of brute force and endurance against the rage of nature. She had fought the storm inside, a battle of will and courage against the terror of the unknown. They had both held their ground. They had both won. The hearth she had kept was more than a fire. It was the beating heart of the ranch, and she, the plain, quiet woman from Missouri, was its keeper. The world was born again in silence and white. The storm had broken sometime before dawn, leaving behind a landscape scoured clean and buried deep. The wind was gone, and its absence was a profound, deafening stillness. From the kitchen window, Nora could see nothing but an endless, undulating ocean of snow. The familiar shapes of the corrals and the barn softened into gentle mounds. The sun, when it rose, struck the new world with a light so brilliant it hurt the eyes, casting long, blue shadows across the drifts. Inside, the house was a haven of warmth and exhaustion. The hands who had made it back were sleeping the sleep of the dead, scattered on bedrolls in the main room. Young Miller, his legs splinted and bound, was resting as comfortably as could be managed. Mrs. Chen had retired hours ago, her own quiet strength finally spent. The only sounds were the soft hiss and pop of the logs in the great fireplace and the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. Nora moved through the quiet house, a guardian of its peace. She had ladled out the last of the stew, refilled the coffee pot a dozen times, and found dry blankets for everyone. Now, in the deep hours of the early morning, she sat at the kitchen table, mending a tear in one of Thomas's small shirts. The rhythmic pull of the needle was a comfort, a small, steady motion in a world that had been violently upended. A small sound from the hallway made her look up. Thomas stood in the doorway, a small, rumpled figure in his nightshirt, his eyes wide with the lingering shadows of a bad dream. He did not cry out, but padded silently across the floor and climbed into her lap, burying his face in the worn fabric of her dress. She wrapped her arms around him, her sewing forgotten. "It is all right," she murmured, her lips against his hair. "The wind has gone to sleep. Everyone is safe." She rocked him gently, humming a tuneless lullaby, her hand stroking his back in slow, soothing circles. He was still so small, his body warm and trusting against hers. A fierce, protective feeling rose in her, so powerful it was almost painful. This small, motherless boy was burrowing his way into the very center of her heart. She did not know how long she sat there, holding the sleeping child, when she became aware that they were not alone. Jack was standing in the archway between the main room and the kitchen, leaning against the doorframe. He was not a man of ice and fury now, but a quiet, weary figure wrapped in a thick blanket. He said nothing, simply watched them, his gray eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lamp on the table. He looked from his sleeping son, so peaceful in her arms, to her own face, and the look in his eyes was one she had never seen before. It was raw and unguarded, a look of profound, aching gratitude. Finally, Thomas stirred and she carried him back to his bed, tucking the quilts tightly around him. When she returned to the kitchen, Jack was still there. He had poured himself a cup of coffee and was staring into the fire. "He has not slept that soundly since the storm began," Jack said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He looked at her, and the silence stretched between them, no longer empty but filled with the unspoken truths of the night they had just endured. Nora simply nodded and began to clear away the mended shirt and her sewing basket. It felt as if a great weight had been lifted from the house, from the world. Jack's gaze followed her as she moved. He spoke again, his voice soft, almost hesitant, as if the words were unfamiliar to his tongue. They sent the ugly daughter as a mail-order bride joke. Nora froze, her hand hovering over her sewing basket. The words, the exact, cruel words of her sister's letter, hung in the warm kitchen air. The old shame, the familiar humiliation, coiled in her stomach, cold and sharp. She could not look at him. Then he finished the sentence, and I found my perfect match. Her head snapped up. She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. His face was completely serious, his gray eyes holding hers with a burning intensity. He was not mocking her. He was not pitying her. He was stating a fact, a truth he had discovered in the heart of the storm. For the first time in her 24 years, Nora Bennett Rohr felt truly seen, not as the plain girl, the useful one, the family burden, but as herself. And she had been found not just acceptable, but perfect. The cold knot of shame inside her began to melt away, replaced by a warmth that spread through her veins like hot cider. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring his image. He stood up and walked to her. He did not touch her. Not yet, during the worst of it. He said, his voice still low, when I could not see my own hand in front of my face, and the wind was trying to tear the soul from my body. I kept thinking about the lights of this house. I knew you were here. I knew you would keep the heart of it safe. That is what a man needs in this country. Nora, not a pretty face, a strong heart. He reached out then and took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused, but it completely enveloped hers, warm and solid and real. He gently traced the worn gold band on her finger with his thumb. Sarah's ring. "I have not been fair to you," he said, and now he looked away, toward the fire. I brought you into a house that was full of a ghost." "She was your wife," Nora whispered. "The mother of your son." "She was," he agreed, "and I will not speak ill of her, but I will speak the truth. It is a truth I have not even admitted to myself until now." He took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into icy water. Sarah was a good woman, but she was not made for this place. She was from Boston. She was used to society, to music, to gentle things. She tried, but the silence, the wind, the hardness of it all, it broke her spirit long before it broke her body. He paused, and the silence in the kitchen was profound. "Our marriage," he continued, the words costing him, "was not a happy one. It was a duty, a mistake we were both too proud to admit. We were two lonely people living in the same house. And when she died, giving birth to Thomas's sister, who we also lost," he stopped, unable to go on for a moment. The pain in his voice was real, but it was threaded with something else. "It is a terrible thing for a man to admit," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But after the grief, the first awful grief, there was relief, a shameful, terrible relief, that the struggle was over. I have carried that guilt like a stone in my gut for 2 years, feeling like a monster for it." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a self-loathing that pierced her heart. He was giving her the ugliest, most hidden part of himself. It was a greater act of trust than any vow they had spoken before the pastor. Nora felt a wave of compassion so strong it erased any thought of judgment. She knew what it was like to be in the wrong place, to feel like a constant disappointment. She could picture Sarah, a delicate woman wilting under the immense, indifferent sky, and she could see this strong, silent man, trapped in a cage of quiet misery, bound by duty to a woman he could not make happy. Her fingers tightened around his. "You are not a monster, Jack," she said, her voice clear and firm. "You are a man who has carried a burden that was not all of his own making. There is no shame in admitting that a thing was broken." He stared at her, a crack appearing in the fortress of his composure. He had expected judgment, or perhaps revulsion. He had not expected understanding. He had not expected forgiveness. "You came here," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "because of a cruel joke. And you have brought more decency and strength to this house than I have known in years. You have given my son back his voice. And tonight you held this ranch together." He raised her hand and, turning it over, pressed his lips to her palm. The gesture was not one of passion, but of reverence. It was a pledge. She looked at their joined hands, at the worn ring that had once symbolized a past she could not share, and saw it for what it was now, a simple gold band, a circle connecting two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of ways. They were not a joke. They were a match, a partnership forged not in a parlor, but in the heart of a blizzard. He did not release her hand. Instead, he straightened up and looked down at her, a question in his gray eyes that had nothing to do with ranch supplies or the weather. It was a question about the future, about the empty spaces in the house and in their lives. Nora knew her answer before he had even fully formed the question. She had come to Roar Creek seeking a place to belong. She had found it. She gave him the smallest of nods, a silent yes that spoke volumes. He took her hand and led her from the warm light of the kitchen, through the quiet, sleeping house. He led her past the door to the small, lonely room she had been given, and he led her to his. The storm was over. The silence outside was one of peace, and inside, for the first time, the house was truly, completely whole. The deep peace of the post-storm world settled over Roar Creek, a quiet that was not empty but full of a new, shared understanding. The clear, cold air of the Wyoming winter was a constant, but inside the stone and timber house, a steady warmth now emanated from more than just the hearth. Jack and Nora had found a new rhythm, an unspoken language in the small gestures of their shared life. The way he would watch her hands as she kneaded dough, The way she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him when he came in from the cold. They were two people building a life not from grand pronouncements, but from the sturdy, everyday bricks of mutual respect and quiet care. It was this newfound partnership that led Jack to push a heavy, leather-bound ledger across the kitchen table to her one evening. It was a different book from her household accounts, its pages filled with his strong, slanted script detailing cattle sales, wages for the hands, and payments for equipment. It was the financial heart of Roar Creek. "I want you to look at this," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "You have a better head for figures than I do. Mine is better for judging the weight of a steer." It was an admission of immense trust. He was not just giving her access to his home, but to the intricate, vulnerable mechanics of his livelihood. For the next week, Nora spent her evenings poring over the numbers. She did not just see columns of figures. She saw the story of the ranch. She saw the lean years and the prosperous ones, the devastating impact of a drought 2 summers prior, the steady drain of costs for feed and supplies. She saw a problem. The profits from the last cattle drive had been lower than expected. The dry summer had resulted in poorer grazing, and the cattle had not put on as much weight. Their cash reserves were solid but not inexhaustible. To survive and thrive in this unforgiving country, a ranch needed to be constantly improving, moving forward, and she saw where they were falling behind. "The irrigation," she said to Jack one night, her finger tracing a line on a hand-drawn map of the property that was tucked into the ledger. "The ditches from the creek only water the lower hay meadows. If we could get water to the upper pastures, we could extend the grazing season by a month, maybe more. We would be less at the mercy of the summer rains." He nodded, his expression grim. "I know, I have known it for 3 years, but the cost of digging a new main ditch and the feeder channels, it is more than we can spare. Not without taking a loan from Shaw's bank, and I will not put this ranch in Martin Shaw's debt." He spoke the name with a deep-seated dislike that Nora now understood. Shaw was a man who collected debts like a wolf collects sheep. Nora fell silent, but her mind was working. She had ridden the length and breadth of the property with Jack in the late fall, learning the contours of the land that was now her home. She thought of a particular stretch of their property, a long, ugly ribbon of land that ran along the far side of Roar Creek. It was useless for grazing, a wide bed of gravel and scrub brush that the cattle avoided. It was considered the ranch's most worthless parcel. "What about the gravel bar?" she asked suddenly, "the long stretch on the eastern boundary." Jack looked at her, puzzled. "What about it? It is good for nothing but rattlesnakes and holding the creek in place during the spring melt." "When we were in Red Mesa," she said slowly, piecing her thoughts together, "I heard men in the store talking. The survey for the new Union Pacific spur line is complete. They say the route will come through the valley, no more than 5 miles east of us." He still did not see her point. "That is good news for getting cattle to market, but that is a year away or more." "What do they need to build a railroad?" "Jack," she pressed, "what do they lay the tracks on?" A slow light of understanding dawned in his gray eyes. "Ballast," he breathed. "Tons of it. Gravel." "And where," Nora said, her voice gaining confidence, "is the closest, most accessible supply of gravel for 10 miles in any direction?" She tapped the map, right on the ugly, worthless strip of land. "It is ours." They looked at each other across the table, the lamplight casting a warm glow on their faces. It was a gamble, but it was a smart one. The land was useless to them, but it could be invaluable to the railroad, and the one man in Red Mesa who would be positioning himself to profit from the railroad's arrival, the one man who would have the capital to buy the land now and hold it, was Martin Shaw. The meeting was set for the following week, in Shaw's office at the bank. It was a room designed to impress and intimidate. The desk was polished mahogany. The chairs were upholstered in dark green leather, and the air smelled of cigar smoke and money. Martin Shaw sat behind his desk like a king on his throne, his smile as polished as the wood. "Jack, Nora, so good of you to come in," he said, his greeting effusive. He gestured for them to sit, but his eyes were fixed on Jack. He barely glanced at Nora, dismissing her as a mere wife, brought along as a formality. What can the Red Mesa Bank do for Roar Creek today? We are not here for a loan. Martin, Jack said, his voice a low growl. He placed the map on the desk. We are here to sell a piece of land. He outlined the parcel, the gravel bar along the creek. Shaw leaned back in his chair, a look of faint amusement on his face. He steepled his fingers. Jack, you know I've always been an admirer of your operation, and because of our friendship, I'm willing to consider it. But you must know that piece of land has no value. It is a wasteland. For the sake of goodwill, I could offer you, say, $1 an acre. It would be more of a gift than a purchase. It was a predatory offer, a pittance meant to take advantage of a rancher he assumed was desperate. He was testing them, probing for the weakness he had suspected the day he first met them in the store. Jack looked at the map. Then he looked at Nora. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was her plan. It was her moment. Nora leaned forward slightly in her chair. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but carried a surprising weight in the silent office. Mr. Shaw, she began, we are aware that the land has no value for grazing cattle. We are not fools. Shaw's smile tightened. He was not used to being addressed so directly by a woman in a business dealing. Well, then, Mrs. Roar, perhaps you can enlighten me as to its other virtues. His tone was condescending, a pat on the head for the little woman trying to play with the men. Its virtue, Nora said, her gaze unwavering, is its proximity to the new railroad survey route. And its composition, it is several acres of the best quality gravel ballast a man could hope for. The smile vanished from Martin Shaw's face. He had not expected this. He had assumed the survey route was still a closely held secret among a few key businessmen in Cheyenne. That is just rumor and speculation, he said, his voice losing some of its smoothness. It is not, Nora countered politely. My cousin's husband is an engineer with the Union Pacific. I received a letter from her last week. The final survey stakes were driven 3 days ago. The contracts for local resources, such as ballast, will be awarded within the next 6 months. It was a complete and utter fabrication. Nora had no cousin with an engineer husband, but she delivered the lie with such simple, unadorned conviction that it sounded more real than the truth. Shaw was silent for a long moment, reassessing the situation. He was no longer dealing with a desperate rancher and his quiet wife. He was dealing with an opponent who had information he did not. An interesting development, he said finally. But the railroad is a long way off. It is still a speculative venture. Perhaps, Nora conceded, which is why we are willing to sell the parcel now, at a price that reflects both its current state and its future potential. Our price is $20 an acre. Shaw let out a short, sharp laugh. $20, my dear woman, that is absurd. Is it? Nora asked. Think of the cost of hauling that much gravel from Cheyenne. Think of the profit you will make when you sell it to the railroad for $30 an acre, or perhaps $40. Our price is not absurd, Mr. Shaw. It is a sound business proposition that leaves a very handsome profit for you, the middleman. We are merely offering you the opportunity to make that profit. We require cash, in full, no loans, no liens, a clean sale. Jack sat beside her, a silent mountain of a man. He had not said a word since the negotiation began. He just watched, his presence a quiet, unshakable endorsement of everything his wife was saying. His silence was more powerful than any threat he could have made. It said, "She speaks for Roar Creek." Martin Shaw looked from Nora's calm, intelligent face to Jack's implacable one. He was trapped. He knew she was right. He knew the value was there. To refuse now would be to admit he had been outmaneuvered. To argue further would be to lose face. He had underestimated the plain woman from Missouri, and it was going to cost him. He sighed, a theatrical gesture of a man being forced into a deal against his better judgment. You drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Roar. He pulled a sheet of paper toward him and picked up a pen. Very well. $20 an acre. The bank will have the funds and the deed ready for your signature by the end of the week. The ride back to the ranch was triumphant. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow. Jack was silent for the first few miles, and then he let out a low chuckle. Nora Roar, he said, the name rolling off his tongue with a deep satisfaction. I do believe you have missed your calling. You should have been a horse trader. It was the highest compliment he could have given. Nora felt a smile spread across her face, genuine and unreserved. She looked at the vast, beautiful, and difficult land around them. It was no longer a terrifying, alien place. It was home, and she was not just its keeper. She was its partner. That evening, after their dinner, Jack pushed the ranch ledger across the table to her again. He dipped the pen in the inkwell and handed it to her. You should make the entry, he said. With a steady hand, Nora opened the book, on a clean line. She wrote the date, and then the words, sale of gravel bar to Red Mesa Bank. And then she wrote the amount, a figure that would not just pay for a new irrigation ditch, but would secure the future of Roar Creek for years to come. The pen felt perfectly balanced in her hand. It was no longer just a tool for writing letters. It was a tool for building a life. The great Wyoming winter finally broke its hold, not in a single, dramatic thaw, but in a slow, grudging retreat. The snow receded from the valleys first, leaving the earth damp and fragrant with the scent of wet soil and pine. The creek, for weeks a silent, frozen serpent, began to murmur and then to roar, its brown, churning water a testament to the coming of spring. On the ranch, the season of survival gave way to the season of work. The new irrigation ditch, financed by the sale of the worthless gravel bar, was becoming a reality. A dark, promising scar across the upper pasture, dug by the sweat of the ranch hands. Inside Nora, a different kind of spring was unfolding, a secret, tender greening that at first she mistook for a lingering weariness from the long winter. But as the days grew longer, the truth became undeniable. There was a new life taking root within her. She did not tell Jack at first. She held the knowledge close, a fragile, precious thing. There was joy, a deep, resonant joy that hummed beneath the surface of her days, but it was shadowed by a cold, creeping fear. The ghost of Sarah, long dormant, stirred once more. The big, silent house had been the site of a tragedy born of childbirth, and Nora could not help but feel the weight of that history. She would run her hand over her still flat stomach, and a chill would pass through her. The fear that this new life might demand the ultimate price, as the last one had. She finally told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the last of the sun's light paint the western mountains in shades of purple and rose. The air was cool and clean. "Jack," she began, her voice quiet, "I am with child." He went very still. His gaze, which had been on the horizon, snapped to her face. For a long moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, she saw it in his eyes. It was not just joy, though that was there, a flicker of profound, wondering happiness. It was overshadowed by a sudden, stark terror. The lines around his eyes deepened, and for a second, he was no longer the strong, capable master of Roar Creek, but a man looking into the face of his own worst memory. He was remembering a different wife, a different birth, a different, catastrophic outcome. The fear she felt for herself, he felt for her, magnified tenfold by the horror of his past. He reached out and took her hand, his grip so tight it was almost painful. "No!" he said, the word a raw, guttural sound. "Not here." The next day, he made his decision known. His voice, when he spoke to her, held no room for argument. It was the voice of a man who had made a vow to himself. "When your time comes, in the fall, we're going to Denver. We will find the best doctor in the city. You will have the baby there, where it is safe." The idea was staggering. Denver was hundreds of miles away, a journey of several days. It would mean leaving the ranch in the hands of Ben Cooper during the critical autumn season. It would be an enormous expense. But looking at the grim, resolute set of his jaw, Nora knew this was not a suggestion. It was a command born of a love so fierce it was willing to move mountains, or at least cross them, to ensure her safety. He was not going to be helpless again. He was fighting the ghost of his past with the most powerful weapon he had: practical, decisive action. The relief that washed over Nora was so immense it left her weak. He was not just her partner, he was her protector. As the summer bloomed across the high country, Nora's body swelled with the new life she carried. The ranch thrived. The new irrigation ditch was working, and the upper pastures were a sea of lush, green grass. Thomas, now a chatterbox, followed Nora everywhere, his small hand often resting on her stomach as if in conversation with the sibling he had not yet met. The house, once so silent, was now filled with his questions and laughter. One afternoon, the mail rider brought a letter from Missouri. The handwriting was Vivian's. Nora's first instinct was to throw it into the stove unopened. She had found her peace, and she did not want the echoes of her old life, with its casual cruelties, to disturb it. But Jack saw the look on her face. "This is your home, Nora," he said quietly. "You decide who is welcome in it, whether it is in person or in a letter." Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The letter was not what she expected. The usual witty, mocking tone was gone, replaced by a stilted, awkward sincerity. Vivian wrote of their father's failing health, of a poor match Caroline had made, of a general sense of ennui that had settled over the farmhouse. And then, the true purpose of the letter. She, Caroline, and Margaret wanted to come for a visit, to see her, to meet her husband. The final line was almost pleading. "We were wrong, Nora. We would like the chance to say so." She read the letter aloud to Jack. He listened without comment, his expression giving nothing away. When she was done, she looked at him, her own feelings a confused tangle of resentment and a stubborn, lingering thread of familial affection. "What should I do?" she asked. "What do you want to do?" he answered. It was the most important question, and as she thought about it, she realized she did not want to carry the anger anymore. Her new life was too full of hope to be burdened by the ghosts of the past, whether they were of this house or the one in Missouri. "I want them to see," she said softly. "I want them to see that I am happy." And so, in the full heat of late July, they came. The three of them looked impossibly delicate and out of place as they stepped down from the wagon, their fashionable dresses and parasols an absurd contrast to the vast, dusty, sun-baked landscape of the ranch. They stared at the solid stone house, at the endless sweep of the valley, at the rugged, silent man who was their sister's husband, and at Nora, who came out onto the porch to greet them. They saw a woman they barely recognized. The timid, overlooked sister was gone. In her place stood a confident, serene woman, her body ripe with pregnancy, her face lightly browned by the sun. She was not beautiful in the way they were, but she possessed a deep, grounded strength that made their fashionable fragility look like a weakness. The reunion was awkward. The sisters presented her with gifts, lace and soaps and other fripperies that seemed to belong to another world. They cooed over Thomas, who eyed them with shy suspicion. The apology came that first evening, after Thomas was in bed. They sat in the main room, the three of them on the settee, Nora in a rocking chair. It was Vivian who spoke, her gaze fixed on her hands twisting in her lap. "We came here to apologize." "Nora," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "The letter, it was a monstrous thing to do. We were bored, and we were cruel. There is no excuse for it. But it was not just the letter. It was everything. The way we treated you. We never saw you. We were so caught up in ourselves, we never truly saw you at all. And we are sorry. Truly, deeply sorry." Caroline and Margaret murmured their assent, their faces full of a shame that was clearly genuine. Nora looked at her sisters, at their beautiful, unhappy faces, and she felt not triumph, but a wave of pity. They were trapped in the same small, gilded cage she had escaped from. "I accept your apology," she said, her voice clear and without malice. "You are my sisters. You are welcome here." The days that followed were a quiet revelation for the Bennett sisters. They saw Nora's life, not as a hardship, but as a kingdom. They saw her manage the vast household with quiet competence. They saw the deep respect in the eyes of the ranch hands. They watched, astonished, as she taught Thomas his letters, her patience seemingly endless. They even tried to help. Their soft, uncalloused hands, clumsy as they shelled peas in the kitchen or tried to weed the small, tenacious flower garden Nora had planted by the porch. The bright marigolds and zinnias were a splash of defiant color against the muted tones of the landscape, another sign of the life she had cultivated here. One afternoon, Nora sat sewing pieces for a quilt. She used scraps from her old dresses, a piece from one of Thomas's outgrown shirts, and even a small square of dark wool from one of Jack's old coats. It was a quilt of her new life, a mosaic of memory and hope. She held up a piece of pale blue silk. "Vivian, do you remember this dress you wore to the summer picnic?" Vivian touched the fabric, a sad smile on her face. "I thought I was so grand in that dress." She looked around the simple, sturdy room. "I was a fool." The sisters left after 2 weeks. Their fashionable dresses were dusty. Their hands were scratched from the garden, and their perspectives were permanently altered. The goodbyes on the platform in Red Mesa were warm, filled with promises to write, and a new, fragile bond of respect. That evening, as Nora was putting away some of the sisters' leftover things, she found a letter tucked away in a drawer. It was addressed to Vivian, in Jack's strong, slanted hand. It was dated a month before their visit. She knew she should not, but she opened it. The letter was very short. "Miss Bennett," he had written, "I understand there is a rift between you and your sister. My wife is the finest woman I have ever known. She is strong and good, and she is the heart of this ranch and of my life. She will soon be a mother. A woman should have her family around her at such a time. You should come and see for yourselves the life she has built. You sent a joke. I received a treasure. Your brother, Jack Rohr." Nora sank into a chair, the letter clutched in her hand, tears streaming down her face. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. This silent, practical man, who showed his love not in pretty words but in profound actions, had not only planned to move mountains for her physical safety, but had quietly, secretly, worked to mend the oldest and deepest wound in her heart. He had given her back her family, not as it was, but as it was meant to be. She was not just loved, she was cherished. The journey to Denver began in the heart of a Wyoming autumn, a season of breathtaking, transient beauty. The aspens on the high ridges had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold, and the air was crisp with the promise of the coming cold. They traveled in a sturdy rented carriage, a small, private world moving through a vast, painted landscape. For Jack, every mile was a battle fought against the ghosts of his own memory. His hands on the reins were steady, his gaze fixed on the road, but Nora could see the tension in his jaw, the haunted look that flickered in his eyes whenever the carriage jolted or she shifted uncomfortably. He was a man driving away from a nightmare, his quiet determination a shield against the crushing weight of his fear. Nora, for her part, felt a strange calm. She was afraid, but her fear was a distant country now. She was anchored by the solid, unwavering presence of the man beside her, a man who would face down the entire world for her safety. She watched the land change, the familiar, rugged beauty of their valley giving way to the high plains, and then Finally, the distant, jagged teeth of the Front Range. She was leaving her home to save a life, and she trusted the man who was leading her. Denver was a shock to the senses, a chaotic explosion of sound, movement, and humanity. After the profound, wind-scoured silence of the ranch, the clatter of trolleys, the shouts of vendors, and the press of the crowds felt like a physical assault. They took rooms in a respectable boarding house, a tall, narrow building that seemed to block out the sky. The room was clean and well-appointed, but it felt like a cage. Nora found herself standing by the window, staring out at the unfamiliar city streets, feeling a pang of homesickness so sharp it was like a blade in her heart. She longed for the scent of sage and pine, for the sight of the endless horizon. The doctor Jack had engaged was a man named Dr. Albright, a calm, graying man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen everything. He examined Nora and pronounced her healthy and strong, his quiet confidence a soothing balm on their frayed nerves. But Nora knew that the battle to come was not one that could be won by medical science alone. It was a battle against memory, against a shadow that had fallen over the Roar Creek house years ago. Her time came on a cold night in late October, with a fierce wind rattling the window panes of the small, sterile room the doctor had prepared. The pain was a rising tide, immense and elemental, pulling her under. But through it all, there was Jack. He never left her side. He held her hand, his own calloused palm a lifeline in the churning sea of her ordeal. He wiped her brow with a cool cloth. He murmured to her, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. "I am right here. Nora, you are not alone. We are doing this right. You are strong. You are the strongest person I have ever known." In the darkest hours, when her courage faltered and the pain threatened to overwhelm her, the ghost of the past rose up. She saw the dust-covered piano. She felt the phantom weight of Sarah's ring on her finger. She thought of the small, unmarked grave on the hill behind the ranch house. The fear was a cold, suffocating presence, whispering that history was doomed to repeat itself, that this house of life would become a house of death once more. She cried out, a sound of both pain and terror. Jack's grip on her hand tightened. He leaned close, his face etched with his own agony and a fierce, protective resolve. "Do not listen to it. Nora," he commanded, his voice raw. "That is the past. We are here, now, you and me, and our child. You will not leave me." His words cut through the fear. He was not just her comfort. He was her general in this battle, drawing on a reserve of strength she did not know she possessed, a strength forged in loneliness, in defiance, in blizzards, and in love. She fought back. She focused on his voice, on the pressure of his hand, on the future they had built and the one that was struggling to be born. And then, after an eternity, the storm broke. A new sound filled the room, thin and furious, and impossibly, miraculously, alive. A baby's cry. The relief that flooded the room was a physical force, so powerful it left them both weeping and breathless. Dr. Albright placed the small, warm, squirming bundle in Nora's arms. A daughter, she had a fuzz of dark hair and a perfect, tiny mouth, and when she opened her eyes, they were a clear, startling gray. Jack sank to his knees beside the bed, his head bowed against the mattress, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. He was not just weeping for joy, but for the release from a prison of guilt and fear he had inhabited for 2 long years. The ghost had been banished, not by forgetting, but by the overwhelming, undeniable power of new life. Later, when they were alone, with their daughter sleeping peacefully in a small cradle beside the bed, Jack looked at Nora, his eyes shining with a love that needed no words. "We should give her a name," Nora whispered, her voice weak but full of a deep, resonant peace. "What would you like to call her?" he asked. Nora had thought about this for months. "I would like to call her Sarah Grace," she said softly. He looked at her, his expression full of wonder and a profound, humbling gratitude. He understood Sarah, not to replace the woman who had come before, but to honor the life that had been, to acknowledge the past without fear, to make it a part of their story, not a shadow upon it, and grace for the beautiful, unearned, and miraculous gift they had been given. It was the name of forgiveness, of healing, of a future redeemed. Their return to Roar Creek was a triumphant procession. The autumn was at its peak, the entire valley a symphony of gold and rust and deep, evergreen. As they rode up the final stretch of the trail, they could see the ranch, solid and welcoming, nestled in its protective embrace. Life was humming. The new calves, born during their absence, frolicked in the pastures. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house, a banner of welcome. The house itself seemed to exhale in relief as they entered. Mrs. Chen met them at the door, her usually stoic face broken by a rare, beautiful smile as she looked at the baby. Ben Cooper stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, a grin splitting his weathered face. But the most important welcome came from Thomas. He approached the bundle in Nora's arms with a grave, cautious curiosity. He peered down at the tiny, sleeping face. Then, he reached out a small, hesitant finger and gently touched his sister's cheek. A look of pure, unadulterated wonder spread across his face. He looked up at Nora, his gray eyes shining. "My baby," he whispered. The circle was complete. The lonely little boy now had a family that was whole and overflowing. That night, after the children were asleep, Jack and Nora sat on the front porch, wrapped together in a thick wool blanket. The moon was a silver disk in a sea of stars, bathing the silent, sleeping valley in a soft, ethereal light. The air was cold and clean and carried the scent of wood smoke and the rich, dark earth. From inside the house, a faint tinkling melody could be heard. Mrs. Chen, in a rare moment of sentimentality, had wound up the little music box on the mantelpiece. The simple tune, once a fragile ghost of a more genteel world, now sounded like a lullaby of profound contentment. It was the heartbeat of their home. Nora leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, a feeling of peace settling into her bones. So deep and complete it felt as if she had finally, after a lifetime of searching, come home to herself. She thought of her journey, of the cruel joke that had become a saving grace, of the plain, quiet girl who had stepped onto that train in Missouri. She was not that girl anymore. She had been tested by the wind and the snow and the silence, by prejudice and by fear. And she had not just endured. She had prevailed. She looked out at the vast, beautiful, and demanding land that was hers. She looked at the strong, decent man beside her, the man who had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. She thought of the two children sleeping safely inside the warm stone house. She was a wife, a mother, a partner, the steady, beating heart of this small kingdom they had built together. She was enough. She had always been enough. Later that night, before she slept, she took out the simple leather-bound journal her mother had given her so long ago. She turned to a fresh page, dipped her pen in the ink, and wrote the last words she would ever need to write in it. Her truth was no longer small or gray. It was as vast and as brilliant as the Wyoming sky. I have been seen. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.